Everything we have to do is to get to the truth has to be sneaky. It seems a shame to sneak to get to the truth, to make the truth such an evil, dirty, old, nasty thing. You gotta sneak to get to the truth. The truth is condemned. The truth is in the gas chamber. The truth has been in your stockyards, your slaughterhouses.
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Dan desu, and welcome to another episode of Alt Hollywood. Today we're going to be talking about the Charles Manson murders, which happened approximately 50 years ago, actually on the night of August 8th, 1969. I'll have a confession here. I've been one of these people who was fascinated by the case ever since I was a little kid and have followed it most of my life. So I have a lot of familiarity with it, both in terms of some of the new things that have come out about it and the old things. And I have my own perspective on it, some of which is a bit controversial. But trust me, in the 50 years since they happened, there's been a lot of changes in what people thought and how the murders were reflected, especially in the arts. What we're going to do in the process of doing this is look at 3 different pieces of film that were done about the murders. The first of them is a documentary that was made pretty much before the murders happened and not released until afterwards. The second is the first TV movie, Helter Skelter, about the crimes. And the third is, of course, Quentin Tarantino's most recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I am going to do some spoilers on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but I will give you ample warning before I'm about to launch into my particular views of certain of the things that are spoiler worthy, so don't worry about that. So let's start first with a little bit of a background on why this case has continued to fascinate everybody. Well, on the most obvious level, it's because it involved Hollywood royalty. It involved a Hollywood star who was at her prime. This wasn't like Raymond Navarro, who had been murdered just the year before by 2 street hustlers. No, this was something that hit very close to home and caused an immense amount of panic throughout the city. Not only because Sharon Tate was so beautiful and so on the verge of moving forward in her career, or perhaps not, who knows. But likely she would have, because she's very good in movies that you don't expect her to be. It also involved Jay Sebring, who was a famous hairstylist. I mean, talk about ridiculous. There were people who were getting paid, who were paying men who were paying $500 for just a regular haircut, and this was back in 1969. So you can imagine what that would be equivalent to today. So he was at the top of it. Wojciech Frykowski was someone who, like Polanski, had escaped from a concentration camp way back when. And Abigail Folger was an heir to the Folgers coffee fortune and also was known as a humanitarian doing a lot of work in South LA. So these were not the kind of people who were supposed to be the victims of this type of a crime. The initial police reports said that it was a drug burn, and that's really what it should be investigated as. As the case moved on forward, it got increasingly bizarre and became hooked in with the whole 60s culture, particularly a group of people known as the family, led by a guru, ex-con Charles Manson, living out at that time at Spahn Ranch, an old abandoned movie set. And it turned out, according to the initial books and the initial history, that Manson had this cult-like following, and he was controlling them in a messianic sort of way, and that he had a plan to cause a race war between whites and blacks, and then because he felt the blacks didn't know how to control everything, he would come out of hiding and then lead the world. At least that's what the rumors said, and to buttress it up, there was all sorts of evidence used with the White Album by the Beatles and the song Helter Skelter and Piggies and all of that. With more information that's come out, with some of the things that the former family members have said, with some of the things that some of the victims' family has said, especially the LaBianca family, that particular side of it doesn't seem to be quite accurate, and that it really was Bugliosi trying against anything to not only get these murderers off the street and convicted, but, and this is the important part, to stop what was really going on from getting more publicity. Certainly, it's already known that within the murder house there were found all sorts of primitive videotapes of Hollywood celebrities having sex, and that gave the LAPD ample opportunity to blackmail the industry for decades after. And that's the real reason that Polanski has been thrown out of the country. It had nothing to do with an overzealous prosecutor. Come on. There are so many people in Hollywood who did so much worse and have skated completely, shall we say. No, I mean, I'm not justifying it in any way, by the way. But Hollywood got rid of him because Hollywood knows that he was responsible for their troubles once the LAPD got their hands on them. Further, it turns out that the LAPD might have been correct. Let's just say, without going into exhaustive detail, because that will take an hour in and of itself, that there were more connections between Manson and LaBianca, the victims of the second night, than merely that LaBianca had called the cops on him at one time when Manson lived next door. It turns out that Manson might have been an employee of his. Secondly, there's the happy, perhaps, coincidence that Tex Watson, the most brutal of the killers, wig shop had in proximity to Sebring's haircutting establishment. They were actually walking distance from each other. Thirdly, there was an uncomfortable connection between Abigail Folger's work in helping people downtown, her relationship with LaBianca, and all that. Suffice to say that Dennis Wilson's car being crashed by family member Clem, the Manson family refusing to pay for it, drug money going back and forth was probably more the reason why the murders happened. They weren't intended to be murders. They were intended to be a shakedown. Things went to hell and it got violent, and the rest is kind of history. Again, a lot of this is still stuff that is subject to a lot of speculation and can we say conspiracy theories, but it's nonetheless something that we will continue to hear about now that Manson is gone, now that Bugliosi is gone, now that most of the people who had any kind of real input in this are no longer with us. So let's see what happens in the probably fairly near future. This is a case that has not gone away. It's sort of like the Black Dahlia. The first of the movies we're going to look at is Manson. Manson is a documentary that was made that was released in 1973. It was made by Robert Hendrickson and Lawrence Schiller. Now, Lawrence Schiller is interesting because in 1977 he was shot. And at the time, there was a lot of people who thought that his murder was somehow connected to Tate LaBianca Manson. And that plus Ronnie Howard, who was one of the original people who testified against them, being shot as well. Even though there were other people who were eventually claimed guilty, there's always the sense that no, this probably still does go back to Manson. This documentary started being filmed before the Mansons were bagged for the murders. It was originally a documentary about this funky family that was living out in Chatsworth, these hippies, and it was meant to be a celebration of them. But what Schiller and Hendricks found when they went there was that there was something creepy about these people. You know the scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where Brad Pitt goes out there and he gets freaked out. That's kind of the reaction that they had to it, even though they probably partook in an orgy or two with them anyway. And in the process of it, you saw some of the family members caressing their gun, Squeaky, who would, of course, later on go to almost kill President Ford, and some of the others saying things that showed that they were very, very devoted to Charlie. It's exploitation at its worst. It's also something where it uses groovy 70s and late 60s and early 70s filmmaking documentary styles borrowed from Woodstock, where you have the same interview shot from different angles and put together in post and all that. Particularly the interview with Paul Watkins, who happened to write one of the most fascinating of the Manson books called My Life with Charles Manson, about his life living with another guru who lived up the road, Brooks Potsdam, I think his name was. Anyway, Paul Watkins was in and out of the family circle because of that, but he never really joined it. The paperback of it, which is one of the holy grails of Manson collectibles, is fascinating to read because it gives all sorts of insight into the cultish atmosphere of that kind of, they were living the dream of the hippie lifestyle, even if they were a little bit more violent than anyone anticipated.
Death was Charlie's trip. Charlie said that everything was death, and that death was life, and that death was all, and that death was this, and that death was that, and that death, die, motherfucker, die. Everything was death.
Whenever we need to, we do. We respond. We respond with our knives. We respond with whatever we have. It feels good. It feels good to be ready to face death and love it.
And the documentary, once the murders happened, took on a whole different feel, and it was re-engineered because of it. But they still had a lot of this very fascinating source material, which you still see come up now and again in television documentaries on Manson, and we know that those are fairly legion as well. I find the movie to be very troubling because you're seeing a lot of these people speaking rawly in a way that they never did on their later interviews. And you can see how high they were during the process of the filming.
And we see all the squirrels and the ground squirrels and chuckers, and we say, "All right, you guys, get in your car, get in the holes, man, because the beasts are coming down the road."
This is the Manson family, probably as close to the reality as we'll ever get for them. And it's because of that you can sense the seriousness of what this whole situation was. The second movie we're going to look at is Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter was made in 1976. Bugliosi and writing partner Kurt Gentry had written a book about the murder case, which basically presents Bugliosi as this great detective who solved the whole thing and knew what was going on and was willing to go with the crazy Helter Skelter prosecution. If you read any of the other books about the Helter Skelter murders, you will see that Bugliosi's telling of it is rather messy. And in fact, if you look at it and think about it a little bit, if you want to know more about the Manson murders and you don't want to get into crazy conspiracy sites, it is the one book that was written about the family that you can safely ignore. Think of it as a very proper authorized star biography, if you will. My favorite book on the family, by the way, is the book The Family by Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders started as someone who had been following the family from way before and had been proclaiming Charlie Manson as a real guru. So when the murders happened, when Manson was bagged, Sanders found himself in a very weird quandary, and he ended up writing the book from the perspective of someone who used to appreciate Manson and now saw what Manson was doing to the hippiedom that Sanders himself really went for and that Sanders himself really believed in. The first edition of the book is the one you need to find. It's a hardback. It was published by Dutton and was ripped out of publication because there were 2 chapters in it about the power and the OTO that were libelous or slanderous. And of course, whenever something is ripped out of publication for those reasons, you want to read those chapters, and Sanders' other research is so strong that you figure, he probably was onto something, but he just didn't have the really hard proof. Much like the new theories about what happened with the Manson. It's still out there, and if you put the strings together, it makes sense, but it's still not the official narrative. Anyway, the movie is a really good TV movie, and it was the #1 rated movie for a long time, and you can see why. It's not great, and it does follow the methodology of the Bugliosi book, but it's a good detective yarn, and it's fascinating to see the performers who maybe are a bit arch, especially Steve Railsback as Manson. He's very charismatic, but he's also on the verge of being unintentionally funny at times with some of his pronouncements. Certainly. We all know that Charles Manson was a really short guy in real life, like 5'2", 5'3". So seeing the way Steve Railsback is behaving, he doesn't have that same power of force.
Sometimes I just want to jump on you and let you shoot me. If I could, I'd grab this microphone, I'd beat your brains out with it, because that's what you deserve. That's what you deserve.
Nonetheless, it's effective, especially as a TV movie. And And it holds your interest even today. And because it was close enough to the murders, you still have that real sense of panic among the people who are participating in it. That sense that, oh, you know, this is really scary stuff. That doesn't stop it from being also a little bit pokey and all that other stuff. But it's probably the most accessible of the Manson of the Manson movies. It was remade in the early 2000s. Don't even bother with that one. That one takes itself way too seriously. It doesn't have the camp value, which makes it unpleasant. This one is more pleasant, if not no other reason than it has a little bit of camp value to it as well during some of the flashbacks, during some of the uses of sound alikes and all of that.
Have you seen the little piggies falling in the dirt? And for all the little piggies, life is getting worse.
It's also famous because it was supposedly released in a more explicit version in Europe and Japan. I happen to have seen it in Japan. And when I saw it in Japan, the extra scenes are actually footage that comes out of the movie Manson, so big deal. And some of the murder scenes were a little bit more graphic, but they're PG, not even 13 graphic, so there's no reason why they couldn't have put them in as a special feature or something like that in the DVD, but that's okay. Anyway, now let's get to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I have very mixed feelings about this movie. On the one hand, I am so pleased to see a movie that even though it uses CGI all over the place, it doesn't use it in a way to impress you. It uses it as a way to recreate the 1960s. Outside of a couple of drives that Brad Pitt has where we see buildings that were built in the 2000s in the background, especially on Wilshire Boulevard, most of the stuff in the backings looks accurate to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if they at least used as a base some of the stock footage that was probably shot in the late 60s or early 70s and used in the backdrop there, because it's that camera accurate, it's that correct. It's either that or the production designers did just the most magnificent job. Another thing that's great about it is the performances. I've got to say, a little bit of Leonardo DiCaprio goes a long way with me, and this movie shows that he for me, that he is capable of playing the other side of an actor. I mean, we all know that he's playing Clint Eastwood in this, or basically a Clint Eastwood type person, and he gets it. He really gets that contrast between someone who's panicked because their career is going away and still trying to cling on to it. And Brad Pitt is equally interesting as someone who is a stuntman, who is a never was. And the tragedy of him is that we know that he's a never will be as well. He's kind of stuck, and he's really not going anyplace. And even though he's still good at what he does, he's still in a sad situation. Unfortunately, there's some other stuff about this movie I don't like. Mike Moh plays Bruce Lee, and there's a scene where he, in his prime, portraying Bruce Lee in his prime, gets into a quote-unquote friendly fight with Brad Pitt. And I don't know if this is intentional. I don't know if this has anything to do with the crazy stuff with Harvard saying that Asians are unfriendly and uncourageous or cowardly. But when they're fighting, Brad Pitt does in fact beat the Bruce Lee character up. He hits him more. Now the fight is not allowed to go on, but it's never denied that the white guy did ultimately win. This is very typical of Hollywood, by the way. I'm not going to get on my podium here, but let's just say that bothered me, the way that Bruce Lee was treated. He is treated still like Ito the houseboy in Maine. So leave that there. Anyway, the interesting thing is it also shows the flashy part of Hollywood, the new Hollywood, portrayed by Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Here's something that bothers me about the movie. Tarantino has always been very misogynistic and very violent towards his female actresses, and he seems to have chosen this movie to go the exact opposite direction. The way that Sharon Tate is portrayed is not good. Margot Robbie obviously is trying hard, but it's the way she's directed. She's playing Sharon Tate as Claudio Cardinale in 8½, which I guess is fine. And she's okay doing that. But we all know that in real life, Sharon Tate was no idiot. She was very strategic in what she was doing with her career. She was able to look at her own beauty and say, how can I utilize this to the best? And she would date Marty Ransahoff, and she would date Jay Sebring before landing with Roman. And it's clear that their marriage was hardly happy. I mean, before she was murdered, and I think it was when she was pregnant, in fact, Roman said, I don't believe in marriage. I don't believe it should go more than 10 years or something. I was like, come on. So there's something about it. I know what Tarantino was trying to do. So, okay, now let's take this opportunity to say what Tarantino was trying to do. What Tarantino is doing with this movie is he's making his own 8.5. He's doing this musing on the creative process, on what it means to be a director, on what it means to look at the world around you and your own interpretation of it. From the way he has stylized the way Hollywood is, from the way he has stylized the way the people are. They're not real any more than the Fellini characters are or the La Dolce Vita characters are. I think it's the most close to the Fellini view. And so it's not real. It's all musing. Yet, it's also dealing with stuff that's really dead serious. So that helps in the film's key scene. Now I know everyone's talking about the scene where Leonardo DiCaprio talks to the young actress, who I think is modeled on Jodie Foster. But I don't think that's the key scene. I think the key scene is the one where Brad Pitt goes to Spahn Ranch. And it's the most quiet scene. It's the most pensive scene. It's the scene where we feel the real tension, the real difference between the view of Hollywood and the reality of what it could be. And it really is scary. When he goes in and he meets Squeaky, and I don't remember what they named her, but he meets Squeaky and he sees how devoted she is to George Spahn. Oh, I slept with him this morning type thing. And Bruce Dern, Bruce Dern does another one of his complete steeled movie one-scene performances in it. And of course, in real life, George Spahn was nowhere near that addlepated at this point. He was still sharp as a tack. He was still making really good deals. He knew what he had with the family. They were kind of a protection team for him as well. So there's stuff in the movie that we don't really go into. So in terms of its formal presentation, I think the movie is spot on. It's really good. A complaint I have about it is the same complaint I have about any Tarantino movie, is that it wallows in its own excess. It's much longer than it needs to be. Every scene in it, even the great scenes, go on longer than they should, to the point where a lot of the virtue of the scene is lost. I definitely think that the scene between Leonardo DiCaprio and the girl would have been better if it was shorter. I definitely think that the scene at the Spahn Ranch could have been tightened up a bit, and it would have been better. If the movie had been half an hour shorter, I would have probably liked it a lot more. For example, the scene where Sharon Tate is going to see her own movie, The Wrecking Crew, which, by the way, I think that the footage up there on the screen is the real footage from the movie. That is Sharon Tate, not the actress. And they play around with you seeing that she's got dirty feet. Okay, nice. But we get it. We don't need to keep having that image thrown at us over and over and over again. And the movie does that. It does it too often. So we find ourselves falling out of it from time to time. That doesn't mean I don't like it. I liked this part of it. And I thought it made a good attempt to show what Hollywood used to do and what Hollywood should still be doing in terms of fostering new filmmakers. I've seen comments on it that say, this is a movie that made me want to make movies again. And I understand that. I understand the passion of someone who's looking at it and saying, wow, this is what we used to see as a regular diet of films. It wasn't really, but it was certainly more common than now. This variety, this ambiguity where we have to interpret what we're seeing. Okay, now I'm going to do the spoiler. So I'm going to talk about the ending. So if you don't want to hear the ending because you haven't seen it yet, please stop watching. All right, the ending of this movie is a big problem. I hated it. And I understand what Tarantino was trying to do. At the end of it, it turns out that the Manson family attack the house where Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt are living instead of Cielo Drive, and they successfully kill the Mansons who are attacking them in a way that's similar to the kind of pictures that the Leonardo DiCaprio character was making. So that's kind of cute. And then at the end, like in a typical Hollywood action movie, Brad Pitt is only slightly wounded. He's going to go off to the hospital. Leonardo DiCaprio then gets invited to the Cielo Drive house, where he's going to get to meet Sharon and Jay and Wojtek and Abigail. And there outside, during the very last shot, is Steve Parent's car. Note that Steve Parent doesn't come out and join them. Steve Parent, by the way, was the first one who was allegedly killed, although some other people say he was the last. Anyway, it's inappropriate. I know that what Tarantino is saying, look, this is what Hollywood does. It takes what's real in real life and turns it into a fantasy. It takes serious situations and puts a happy ending on them that's not real. So I'm going to do that too with this event. And I found that morally reprehensible. And I know that I'm, playing church lady here. But I think for people who are of a certain age, perhaps my age and older, this ending has to be creepy because it's something that we knew, it's something that impacted us. Now, yeah, for me it was a weird impaction because the way I found out about it is that I was really into horror movies when I was growing up. And in like first or second grade, they showed The Fearless Vampire Killers on the CBS Late movie as its world premiere. And during the bumpers, they kept saying, starring the late Sharon Tate. And I knew what late meant, and I asked my mom, how did she die? She looks really young in this, and this isn't an old movie. This is a movie that's like 4 years ago. And my mom says, well, she had a disease. Okay. Parents wanting to save their kids from knowing what's going on. Guess what happened on the news? I see the Manson murders. I see them talking about Sharon Tate. I said, oh, so she was murdered. Why didn't you say so? My parents, by the way, even at that young age, never again lied to me when I had a question about something that was serious. That included what was going on with Vietnam, the riots downtown in D.C., the streakers, all of that stuff. They were willing to tell me what was up, and I appreciate the fact that they did that. But maybe because of that, maybe because I was fascinated with Sharon Tate, maybe because I was fascinated with Valley of the Dolls, maybe because I ended up working for Tony Scotti, who co-starred with Sharon Tate in Valley of the Dolls, maybe because of all of that, and maybe because I met Terry Melcher, maybe because I met some of the Manson girls, mainly Gypsy and Weish and come on, Dan, Sandra Good. Who all were wanting to do a TV series or an interview show or something like that about Manson. So maybe because I've actually had that intersection with them, that I feel really uncomfortable with this ending where they make it a happy ending. It bothered me. I know this is an exaggeration, but it's almost as if it takes a tragedy and turns it into something that is making a point, but it's a point that I wish was made in some other way.
They're persecuting what they can't stand to look at in themselves. The truth. They can't stand to look at the truth in themselves. They persecute themselves.